Hello and welcome to the first episode of Below the Surface. I'm your host Darshna Kamani, and before we delve into our topic today, I would like to introduce you to my co-host Stephanie. Welcome, Stephanie.
Hey there, Darshna, and hello everyone. Hey there, I'm your co-host Stephanie Cavigliano. Very excited to be here today.
First show, Stephanie. Are you ready?
I sure am. And what an interesting show we have for you all today. So today we're going to be speaking to Alessia Klevchuk, a product marketing manager at Barrcuda who specializes in email protection. So in a study recently carried out by Barrcuda, we found that 82% of organizations faced some email security threat in the past 12 months. And for 25% of organizations, these email attacks costed them $100,000 or more.
With email being such a core communication part of businesses, it's definitely an interesting topic and why we need to ensure businesses are protected from such threats. So let's bring on Alessia so we can discuss the top email threats that impact businesses and how to protect against them, as well as some of the latest threats that Barrcuda has found. Welcome, Alessia.
Thanks, team. It's great to be here. I'm so excited to be your first guest.
Thank you so much for joining us, Alessia. So I do want to quickly remind our audience to please submit any questions or comments to us by using the comments box, and we'll do our best to answer any questions. Now, to kick things off, Alessia, would you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm a product marketing manager at Barrcuda. I look after email security products. I've been with Barrcuda for a couple of years now, and before that, I worked in email security, brand protection, and IT research.
Fantastic. It's really great to have you join us. Email attacks are definitely dominating news stories at the moment, especially in this current time when most of us are remote working. Cyber criminals definitely follow the crowd. There have recently been some stories of companies being breached, such as a big business email compromise scam in Norway. Can you tell us a bit more about this, Alessia?
Sure. So Norway State Investment Fund has recently discovered that they have lost around $10 million to a business email compromise attack. They are still trying to investigate as to what's actually happened and how they came about to losing so much money. But it's very clear that hackers have invested a lot of time into orchestrating this attack, setting this up, and executing the attack as well. So the way it's actually happened is attackers managed to penetrate Norfund's network and were inside their environment for quite some time. How it's happened, they're trying to investigate and figure this out, but it's most likely was some form of a phishing email. We know that breaches happen because of phishing attacks most of the time. That's how most of the breaches take place. And once the hackers are inside your environment, and that's what happened to the Norfund as well, is they don't actually start launching attacks right away. Very often they have a very long game in mind, and they spend a lot of time in reconnaissance, and that's what they did. They sat inside their networks, learning and watching about ins and outs of the businesses, what kind of deals they have in progress, and waiting for the right time to launch their attack. And the right time did come. Norfund was having a business dealing with a Cambodian firm that they were looking to provide a loan for them. So at the right time, hackers impersonated one of the Norfund's employees. They've sent an email to the right people that sounded very realistic, very authentic, having the background knowledge of all of the business business that Norfund was doing with the Cambodian firm, and asking them to make the transfer for the loan for the $10 million. Norfund didn't think of anything. They were expecting an email like that, so they didn't think much of that, and they made the transfer. The hackers didn't actually stop there. They've set it up pretty well, because they went to the Cambodian firm and told them that their funds will be delayed because of COVID-19, and asked them to sit tight and wait. So it took actually some time for them to discover the attack. And when the attack was discovered, unfortunately, it was already too late and the money were gone.
Really interesting and quite scary too, I might add. So how would you suggest companies protect themselves from something similar happening to them?
Yeah, there are a number of steps that organizations can take, and first and foremost, you do need to have some form of phishing protection and spear phishing protection in place to protect yourselves against attacks like business email compromise or account takeover as well. And account takeover was a big part of this attack. They were obviously inside organizations' accounts, so ability to not only prevent those attacks happening, but if they did happen, being able to identify that you have a hacker, you have somebody else inside your environment, being able to detect those and remediate very quickly. And of course, don't forget the users as well, educating your users, making sure that they're able to recognize when attacks, what emails are genuine, what emails are not, what kind of behaviors they need to look out for. And then finally, you want to put in place some policies just to make sure that when you do have a very large money transfers, for example, that you have a policies in place to double check that. Is a request for 10 million wire transfer should only come through the email, or should you have some other ways to go and double check, such as in person or having conversations? A lot of money to just to request via email.
Yeah, it sure is. So how about, given the current situation, a lot of us are working remote. It's an unusual time for businesses, as we all know, as well as for individuals. Has it had an impact on email scams? And what should organizations be paying attention to during this time?
Oh, yeah, for sure it did. We've been tracking spear phishing attacks and all sorts of other email threats over time. And what we've noticed is that there was a real spike in the number of phishing attacks, particularly those that are using COVID-19 as a lure, as a kind of a trick to get the victims to either click on email or to respond to their attacks. So as we all went and started working from home in kind of around March this year, I think that's when most of the countries started to shut down. That's when we really saw the spike going up, with those a spike of over 600% of spear phishing attacks that were using COVID-19, either in the title or as a context of the email. And those attacks were, to begin with, they were mostly scamming attacks. They were looking to sell you face masks or cure, or looking for various investments in organizations that are looking for vaccines and cures for COVID-19. But with time, they started to become a little bit more complex. And even then, we were seeing a number of more targeted attacks, like business email compromise attacks, or attacks that were impersonating well-known brands. We saw a lot of impersonation of World Health Organization and CDC in the US. So those kind of organizations that you want to get information from, you think that they are legitimate, they want to communicate something to you that is important. And people are very distracted. They're working from home. They're very worried about their situations, and when they receive an email, they might not pay as much attention to it, especially if it's about a topic that is top of mind for them. They're less likely to think it through. And also because we are all at home, and because we're all working very often on the mobile devices, we are checking our emails on our computers as well as the mobile phones, and we're also using our work devices probably for personal reasons a bit more than usual, because again, we're kind of blending this work and home environment together. So there's a lot more opportunities for hackers to really monetize on this event, and it's not unusual for them to do that. Every year during hurricane season, we see spikes in hurricane-related attacks in the U.S. So this is just something the organizations need to be aware of, that there is a heightened security risk when it comes with events like this, and particularly when so many of us are remote and at home.
It's definitely scary times and hard to always detect, but it seems to be a growing problem. And I know, according to a report by Verizon, they recently found that credential theft, social attacks are the cause of majority of breaches. I think they said around 67% or more. Do you agree with this? And is this what we see as well at Barrcuda?
Yeah, Verizon report had really had three main focuses, and it was really kind of found three trends that are contributing to security breaches within the organization. Social attacks, like you mentioned, business email compromise being one of them, credentials theft, and that's a lot has to do with account takeovers, when somebody takes over your account and able to steal your login information, and just simple errors on behalf of individuals. When we start looking, we will look first at the social engineering attacks. Like, sure, we see a very steady growth of those over time. Hackers are constantly evolving also their attacks. The type of attacks we saw this time last year are very different to the types that we see today. It's not all about malware anymore. It used to be most of the attacks would have, well, most attacks still have malware within them, but they're most effective attacks are those that use social engineering tactics, and that's why that's kind of the fastest growing segment of the attacks. Credential theft is usually very often a byproduct of those attacks, not always, but a lot of the time hackers will use social engineering tactics to steal login credentials so they can get inside those accounts, which are incredibly valuable for them. And because of that, we see the growth in credential theft and account takeover as well. There are many ways to steal credentials, but phishing is by far the most common ones, and they'll steal it, and sometimes they'll sell it, sometimes they use it for their own purposes as well. And then finally, just the human error, and the human error has been there last year, has been there 5 years ago, and it will continue being there. And it's the best way to forward against human error is continuing to educate people what they should be paying attention to. But accidental deletion of data and accidental loss of data does happen. So having policies in place that prevent that valuable data leaving the organization, or if it did leave the organization, whether that's for erroneous reasons or malicious reasons, you have an ability to restore that data and that information very quickly and recover and continue working without losing too much productivity.
So this brings us really nicely to something that Barrcuda recently released, which is an ebook on the 13 email threat types. Now, before we get there, I do want you to tell us, Alessia, some of the basics of email as just a general threat vector. Why should organizations really care about the main issues that this causes?
Yeah, email is a number one threat vector, and we talked about this earlier with numerous examples of how email was used as a way to get inside the organization. And the same majority of data breaches start with an email attack. Is almost like an underestimation of that. Almost every single data breach will start with an email attack, and a vast majority of those attacks are phishing attacks as well. And especially now, we talked about how we all working from home, and with the rise of COVID-19 related attacks, this is becoming a more of a kind of a favorite tactic of hackers to get inside the organizations. The reason why email is particularly important is that hackers are always looking for an entry point into your organization, and breaching your network sometimes can be really hard for them. But email seems to be an easy way in. We all receive millions of emails every day. There's millions of emails being exchanged between between individuals within the organization, as well as those coming from outside of the organization, from your partners, from your customers. And one of them might be an illegitimate email, might be a hacking email, and that's something that people expect to get. They expect to get an email, and because they expect to get that, and hackers are using it as a way into their organization. All they need is to design a clever enough email or enough number in terms of volume to be able sooner or later to get in. They only need one person within the organization to fall for that attack to have a way in. We also use our mobile devices a lot more than we did before, and it's a lot more difficult to verify on a mobile device whether your email is coming from a person you are actually expecting it to come from. There's a lot less information that is available for you on a mobile device to check and validate the identity of an individual or the organization that you expect the email to come from. And email data is just very, very valuable. Just getting access into the email is incredibly valuable for hackers. Just think about it, we all use our inboxes not just to communicate with each other, but sometimes even to store information. I get a lot of information coming into my into my inbox, and very often I just keep it there, and very often I'll just search through my inbox for specific files or documents. Some of those documents for some organizations and for some departments could be incredibly sensitive and valuable. So getting access to your email gives you access to the data. If organization also has an Office 365 accounts in place, it gives you access to SharePoint and OneDrive. So a vast amount of data, vast amount of information that the hackers can go and parse through and steal and use to their own advantages.
I mean, I know I definitely use my emails to store all the information that comes in, just like you, Alessia. So as Stephanie mentioned, Barrcuda highlighted 13 email threat types. Could you run down some of those threats and, what we're seeing, and do organizations need to cover for all 13 of those areas?
Yeah, so researchers at Barrcuda have looked at all various types of threats across across the different across all customers that we have today, and we've researched them, we've looked them, and we've done this with the thought of categorizing them into various groups and types of threats. So we came up with the 13 threat types, and they are by no means distinct. Sometimes they do overlap, and hackers very often use multiple tactics and multiple types of attacks in a single attack. Like we saw, for example, with a Norfan example earlier on, there was a business email compromise attack, there was an account takeover, there was probably some form of a phishing attack to begin with. So there was a number of different tactics used. And we've put them onto a spectrum from a more complex type of attacks on one hand, such as spam and malware, and a more targeted and a complex attacks that more of impersonation type of attacks, such as business email compromise and account takeover. And those attacks, they're a lot more difficult to detect. So those attacks are that on the right spectrum are very hard to detect with the traditional gateways compared to the ones on the left. The traditional gateways are pretty effective at spotting, detecting, and blocking from entering within the organization. So if we take kind of an example of how some of these attacks might unfold, or how they all work together. So let's say you get something like an impersonation, a service impersonation attack. It's an attack. There's you get an email. Appears to come from Office 365 or from Microsoft. It's asked you to check your activity. There's some check your password, check your recent activity, something like this, and you'll click on the link. It will take you to a login page, which will look very legitimate and very carefully designed web page. Very often it's not going to get detected by the gateways because the email from which that attack is coming from has not been used in the phishing attacks before. Sometimes they might use emails, mail services such as Gmail. They have a very high reputation, so it will let through. The reason why the link is not going to get detected is because that link has only been live for a very short period of time. It's never been used before in a phishing attack, so there is no real intelligence behind it that will trigger a gateway to think that this is a malicious link or malicious email. Once you enter your login details, it might lead you to an account takeover, and it goes through various stages of a hacker learning about your organization, understanding what you're doing, who you're communicating with, who's who within the organization, looking for any business deals that might be happening at this moment that they can really use to start monetizing. And once they start to monetize, they're looking at to launch additional attacks, such as business email compromise, which is requesting wire transfers, for example, and so forth. And a lot of the time, the business email compromise attacks, they're not always part of the account takeover, but sometimes they can be. But they're incredibly effective in the way that they lead to those wire transfers. We see that about 7% of all the spear phishing attacks that we see today are actually business email compromised attacks. And although they might appear to be small in numbers, they lead to around $1.7 billion in losses, according to FBI. So those attacks are very effective, and they might appear to be very not much in the nature and very kind of scammy appearing, but they're just asking you, are you at your desk? Do you have a moment? Can you do a favor for me? But they're looking to establish that trust to get to to ask for the wire transfer later on. And a lot of the time they are effective. Otherwise, hackers wouldn't be using them in the way they do.
So what are the specific impacts of these different threat types on organizations?
The impact very much depends on the type of attack that we see. So, for example, with the spam, something on the left hand of a spectrum, it's really just about the loss of productivity and just the general annoyance. So if you're getting a lot of spam in your inbox, your legitimate emails, the emails that you do need to pay attention, can really have an impact on your productivity. You can't really find those emails that you're looking for. You also will struggle to, your mail service might struggle with the volume of email that is getting into your organization as well. So spam is a very high volume attack. So about 50% of all emails out there are spam. So if all of a sudden you're getting bombarded by thousands and thousands of emails, it slows down the performance of your mailbox. Spear phishing, on the other hand, they generally lead to monetary losses. So the attackers really invest a lot of time and a lot of efforts into designing those attacks and researching their victims. So they want a big payout of some kind. So it could range from hundreds of dollars to millions and millions of dollars as well. So we already looked at an example of business email compromise and how one of those attacks might unfold. But one of the attacks that we actually start seeing a lot of is conversation hijacking. And it's kind of like a spin of some kind on business email compromise. It's a hacker is impersonating usually either a vendor or a partner of some kind. That you would usually have some form of business dealing. Maybe you've been exchanging invoice details with them over the past months. Maybe this is kind of a regular conversation that you have. Your vendor sends you an invoice every month, and every month you approve it, and then they'll send you another invoice, and then you approve it again. And then, one day the vendor sends you an invoice and says, hey, by the way, I need you to check my account details. And you don't think much of it because that's a pretty standard thing to do. Of course, account details can change sometimes. Change account details and you wire the money. Unfortunately, that last email came not from your vendor, but from the hacker, who have hijacked the conversation, insert themselves at the right time, provided with the new account details, and wired the money into a fraudulent account. By the time the organization came to realize, sometimes it can be too late to do anything about this. It's a real big problem, especially in some industries. If you think about real estate, for example, you are looking to close on your house. You've got your thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars that you have saved, or euros, whichever amount, whichever currency you're saving in your bank account, ready to buy that house that you were looking for so long. And then, your real estate agent says, here's the account details. You wire the money, and the money gone. And it's a big, big problem, and it's very important to have access to, to be able to block this kind of attacks. So overall costs of data breaches for organizations are estimated in millions and millions, and unfortunately, no one is safe. And to be as safe as you can against these attacks, you really need to invest in this multi-layered email protection, not just in the ability to filter through email, but additional layers of education and more kind of AI-based technologies as well.
And now these attacks are happening every day. In fact, our researchers recently discovered a new tactic used by attackers, which was the form-based attacks. Can you tell us more about this attack and what we found, and how do they fit within the 13 threat types?
Sure. Form-based attacks is a type of attack that we have discovered over the past, it's been around for probably some time, but we started tracking it over the past few months. It's a type of impersonation attack that hackers are using, trying to impersonate either an employee or very often a service of some kind. It's usually a productivity or a file sharing site. Think about like Google storage site, OneDrive. The idea behind this attack is that they will leverage those legitimate sites, and they will send links to those legitimate sites and the documents posted within those legitimate sites in the email, asking the victims to do something like verify their account details or download the document and so forth. So the idea is that they are looking to steal credentials, eventually login credentials from these attacks. The individual will log in and will follow the link that will take them to a legitimate site such as a OneDrive, and then it will take them onto a different website where they will enter their login credential. The difficulty with the form-based attacks is because the link included in the email actually leads to a legitimate site. It's not blocked, even if it's scanned by link protection or URL protection type of technologies. It's not blocked. So it's a very effective way of tricking somebody into disclosing information.
So I'd love to see an example of one of these. Can you give an example of how these attacks unfold so we can see exactly what it is that makes them so difficult to detect?
Yeah, of course. There is. So here's an example for you. It's really very often starts with just an email. The email will ask, in this particular email, it's asking you to follow the link to confirm some information. And once you follow the link, it will take you to the form. And that particular form is hosted on the Form's office website, which is a perfectly legitimate website. But hackers are designed it to look like as if it's a login page. They've even included a logo of an organization there that they're trying to impersonate. They've asked you to enter some information like your password and your username as well. And once you do that, it's hackers, you're just filling in the form. You think you're logging in, but you are just filling in the form. And hackers have the login information now, and they can use it. So it's not really a phishing website per se, but they have used services provided by organizations such as Microsoft, like this Forms.office, to turn it into a phishing site for themselves. And it's really difficult for just a standard filtering technology to detect this. And there are various variations on this type of attack. Sometimes you get an email from a OneDrive asking you to follow to follow the link to download the document. You follow the link, and it takes you to the OneDrive, where you have another link that says, click this link to safely download the document. And you check, and it says OneDrive on the URL. You click on the link, and then it takes you to a phishing or a malicious site. So again, because it takes you on this loops and takes you through this number of different sites before you eventually get to a malicious site, you're already outside the organization's kind of email security controls that might prevent you to lead to the phishing site. So hackers are really getting smarter in the tactics and the way they are trying to trick users.
So, Alessia, like you said, it's difficult to spot. It's that it all looks legitimate. So then, how do organisations stay protected? What are the best technologies organisations can use to protect against such threats?
So there are really two types of technologies that exist when it comes to protecting organizations. Most organizations in place today will have an email gateway of some kind. This is what they have. It's a technology that is a filtering technology that sits between your mail server and your inbox and the internet. So you have emails as they come in, they go through your email gateway, and if the email gateway decides that it's a legitimate email, it allows for it to be delivered into your mail server. It works really, really good for things like spam and malware, and as well as outbound email. So any information that will be leaving the organization as well, it'll filter those. Even things like zero-day attacks, technologies like sandboxing, for example, will sit at that gateway level and look at any malware that may have never seen before, open those suspicious attachments in controlled environments and see if it behaves in a way that it shouldn't be behaving, and if it has malicious code within that, and then block delivery of that attachment. So it works really, really well for emails that have a malicious payload or intent, or they are behaving maliciously in one way or the other. The challenge starts when we start running into the spear phishing attacks, and those attacks are designed to bypass the email gateways. That the whole way that hackers go about, they know what the filters are, they know what the security is like within the organization. So they've designed spear phishing attacks. They use social engineering tactics to go bypass the gateway, and that's where you need a protection beyond the gateway, not just at the gateway level. And that beyond the gateway protection is what we'd call an API-based inbox defense. It's a technology that integrates directly with users' inboxes, and it has a visibility into both internal communication, so anything that happens internally within email sent internally within the organization, but it also has visibility into historical data. It then uses that historical communication to create a sort of statistical model that represents how each individual within the organization communicates and what kind of emails they send around, what's normal communication looks like, what kind of email you're expected to get from outside the organization, from whom, and so forth. And that is a way more effective way of detecting abnormal behavior or abnormal emails, which very often would mean that these are attacks and malicious emails than gateways at the entry point. At the same time, it's not a question which one you have. Do you have a gateway or do you have an inbox defense solution? You really need to have both to protect against those 13 threats.
Okay, so you need both API-based inbox defense, you need gateway protection. Can you maybe break this down for us? So let's start. What are the pros and cons of gateway protection?
Yeah, the gateway, as I've mentioned earlier, its biggest pro is that it blocks emails from actually entering the mailbox. So it's really good for the high volume attacks. So if you think about all of those malware and spam that would otherwise come in and flood your mail service and your inboxes, it really because it blocks those messages before they reach your mail server, it has no impact on your performance, your email performance, and that's what we're aiming for here. It's also a technology that's been around for quite some time. So the spam filters are very good today. Signature-based protection against malware is very good today. And then also the outbound filtering is something that you do need in place to prevent any malicious or accidental loss of data, as well as for many industries and organizations to stay compliant with how they send information, personal information, for example, outside of the organization. The disadvantages of email gateways that when attacks that are highly targeted are able to bypass those filters. They are designed to get around them because they are in a smaller volume. They're highly targeted attacks. So they're designed to get through and land in users' inboxes, and especially those when they don't have anything malicious about those attacks. This kind of over-reliance on policies and rules is an advantage to some types of attacks when it comes to gateways, like spam and malware, but it's a real downfall when it comes to more targeted attacks like spear phishing.
Okay, so we've talked about the gateway protection, the pros and cons. So then how is API-based inbox defense implemented, and what attacks can it block?
Yes, the API inbox defense works differently from the gateway, and it's a kind of a perfect add-on, or an addition to your email gateway to make it your security complete. The API integrates directly with your inbox. It's because it gets access to that internal and historical data. It uses that data to train the AI and create that statistical model about how each individual within the organization can talks and how they communicate with whom. So if you think of an example, like who do I usually send an email from? What business applications usually will send emails to me? Do I usually ask for wire transfers? Does the CEO within the organization usually ask for the wire transfers? Do they usually share emails or certain information internally? What are the relationships like within between different individuals within the organization? So it's basically looking what's normal communication looks like, who's talking to whom and how. And because it understands who's talking with whom and created this social graph about each individual, it's able to identify when abnormal communication takes place and something odd happens, and an email from an individual that comes from a wrong email address, for example, that's never been used before, or an unusual link being shared, or even an unusual request that's been made. So as we would take an example of business email compromise. Does your CEO usually ask for wire transfers? That's what the AI model will look for. Does he usually send, or she sends, an email from Gmail accounts? That's another thing that might trigger it. How does he usually sign his name? Does he say it Matt or Matthew? All of those things will be taken into account when the AI is looking for the impersonation attempt. So if we look similarly on the brand or service impersonation side, the AI is really relying on the historical knowledge of what domains are usually being used by Office 365 and Microsoft. They have a lot of different domains, but which are normal ones and which may look unusual. So there are a lot of different variables, as you can probably gather, that goes into that model. And of course, you can take your gateway and you can configure it to that extent as well, and you can configure all the rules and policies. However, it's just not scalable. It will either produce a very large number of false positives and false negatives when the email starts coming in, or you will have to limit that protection to just a few individuals within the organization, so that you're able to not only create all of those rules and policies and customize it to all of those individuals, but also able to manage it over time. And there are some attacks that you just cannot do anything when it comes to account takeover. When it comes to email gateways, account takeover is being one of them. Account takeover is something that takes place inside the organization. Email gateways are completely blind to those. You already have a hacker inside the organization. Email gateways cannot see what's happening inside because they sit at your perimeter and outside of your organization. The disadvantages of API-based inbox defense is basically those that are advantages of email gateway, and that's why they complement each other so well. It does allow for the email to actually be delivered into the inbox. So if you use just the API inbox defense to protect against all attacks, you might get an impact on the performance of your inboxes because spam malware will first have to be delivered to the inbox and before it's instantaneously being pulled out of your mailbox. But it will have a negative impact on the performance.
Thanks for breaking that down for us, Alessia. It makes sense that you would need a highly sophisticated solution for those highly sophisticated attack types. So before we sign off here today, we know email threats are going to evolve and change as time progresses, just like they always have been. So what strategies would you suggest to organizations that they can implement so they stay on top of those increasing risks?
There's a couple of things that you can definitely do. First is we encourage you to go and download that ebook. I've talked about a few examples from our ebook, but if you go on barrcuda.com, it's right there on the homepage. You can download and go through a lot of other detail about all 13 threats, why they're happening, how they work, why some types of protection are better than others when it comes to these threats. And once you have that knowledge in place, try to identify what kind of gaps you might have in your email security. Do you have a good gateway in place? Do you have a good outbound protection in place? Do you have an API-based inbox defense? Are you fully covered when it comes to detecting and blocking these attacks? And then also, just don't stop at the technology point. It's not just about the technology. You need to make sure that you educate your users as well, because unfortunately, no email security is 100% effective 100% of the time. So sometimes something will get through sooner or later, and having a well-educated, well-trained staff within your organization can go a very long way in protecting against these attacks. And once you've trained them and they'll start reporting all these attacks to you, you need to have a very fast response. So automating your incident response is also something that you want to make sure that you layer on top of your email security, so that you're able to detect those attacks, your staffers are able to report those attacks, and then you're able to respond to any that might have got through really quickly before it really spreads across the organization and causes damage to your businesses. So make sure you have all the layers of protection in place. You have response, you have remediation in place, as well as just detection and protection.
Some great tips. Well, Alessia, thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks for all of the information that you provided on these types of email threats and what organizations can do and the strategies that they can implement to protect themselves from them.
Yes, thank you so much, Alessia, and thank you all for joining us for our first episode of Below the Surface. Hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to go to barrcuda.com to download your free copy of the ebook that was discussed today. Until next time, have a safe journey.